Hello and welcome back to RPMbassy. Today I'm going to be talking about an album that I think is kind of fitting for this time of year. Not the Christmas period, but the winter period. And it's one of my favourite soundtracks of all time to probably my favourite film of all time. And it is Ennio Morricone's soundtrack to The Thing, the 1982 film of the same name, John Carpenter film. So this soundtrack is a really, really amazingly put together, really thoughtful score, which for some of the tracks, they weren't actually sort of as appreciated as I think they should have been until much, much later. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But to start off with, this in particular is the Waxworks Records pressing. This is from 2017, February of that year, and it's a nice, simple sort of package, but you know, a couple of extra nice bits and pieces. So you've got a gatefold. It is one record only, but you've got a gatefold with some really, really cool looking art, nicely put together there. Sort of simple shape-based art there, but really, really just nice thing to have. And obviously you've got the record itself, which is a white splatter. Really, really nice. I love the red on that second side there. Kind of so in keeping with the sort of theme of it. And then on side one there, you've got the dog and the title. Really, really cool piece there. And finally inside you get small little fold out poster. Again, nice and simple. And again, this is a drawn one rather than a still from the film. Although from this distance for you, it probably does look like a still from the film. But yeah, just a nice sort of thick paper or thick card. Just a really nice little thing there. So let's talk about it. So as I say, this is a soundtrack from Ennio Morricone. The actual film itself had some music as well from John Carpenter, the film's director, and probably the song that a lot of people will know is sort of the quote-unquote main theme of The Thing, and that's actually with the electronic sort of stabs, the boom boom. And the version that most people are aware of with the sort of proper sort of electronic sounding bass, that is one that John Carpenter put together, but the sort of the seed of that is from this version. And the sort of two biggest tracks on the score, in my opinion, the songs Humanity Part 1 and Part 2. So Part 1 does feature quite heavily in the film. It's kind of almost a toned down version. It's got the main sort of melodic parts of we'll call it the Thing theme, but it doesn't really have that kind of stabby bass or any sort of like impactful sort of percussive elements. It's very, very subtle. And then Humanity Part 2, that's where you get essentially almost like the orchestrated version of the John Carpenter version. And personally for me, I prefer Ennio Morricone's version of it. It's I think has a bit more subtlety to it. And it's got this kind of like creeping feeling, which I absolutely, absolutely love. So as I say, there are also some tracks on here that essentially went unused in the film, and they were available to listen to. There were bootlegs of this score around for years, probably basically since the release of the film in '82. But there are a few tracks that didn't get used on the final sort of cut of the film, and they ended up being used on Quentin Tarantino's film The Hateful Eight, which Morricone also composed most of the score for, if not all of the score, in fact. So they were essentially reused on there, and it kind of makes sense if you've seen Hateful Eight. The very similar sort of thematics, actually. You know, this sense of distrust, the isolation, and you know, essentially being trapped by the weather and the snow. So very, very fitting that it's those tracks were sort of brought in. And I believe as well, because those tracks were taken from a previous sort of score, it did mean that there were certain awards categories that Morricone wasn't able to be nominated for, like specifically like anything listing things as like original soundtrack, because technically it wasn't original. Even though he made it, it wasn't an original soundtrack for the film itself. So yeah, I'll just go through a couple more of the tracks, because, as I say, it's sort of a subtle score compared to some of the more, we know Morricone for like some of his incredible melodies on like the Dollars trilogy. It's not a trilogy, but the Dollars trilogy, as we sort of generally call it these days. And his sort of sense of melody, I think, is one of his biggest strengths. But actually, he's got a phenomenal ear for tone and mood. And in this in particular, it absolutely shines through. One song that I love, a very short one, is Contamination. That track lasts for all of like maybe 2 minutes, but it's such a perfectly put together song. The way I'm going to go ahead and spoil a few elements of the film. It's been over 40 years, it's been 42 years. If you haven't seen it now, that's probably on you. So, as many people will know, the thing is this sort of almost like viral sort of being that assimilates other creatures, other organisms and life forms, and kind of takes itself into them and then kind of takes over them, and it's sort of this almost hive mind like creature. And the way that's sort of demonstrated, and particularly there is a scene where Wilford Brimley, he goes on a computer and he kind of simulates how long it will take for humanity to be fully taken over. And obviously it's sort of laughable to look at these days, like the way this computer can somehow judge this entirely random thing that he's just discovered. But that's science fiction for you in the 80s, I suppose. But the sort of cellular activity that it sort of mimics, that kind of way of cell duplication and copying and assimilation and stuff. It's got this weird sort of chaotic, frenetic look to it, and Contamination is excellent. It's nearly all like pizzicato noises, like violins and stuff like that, and there's no real tonality or melody to it. It's quite dissonant, but it's so fast and like, and it works so perfectly. If in your head, if you visualize sort of how we see like cellular activity through a microscope, it's spot on. It just really, really hits home so well. And that song in particular, as I say, there's no melody to it basically at all, but it's excellent in representing what that film is trying to get across, and I really, really love that. A couple more tracks. Eternity, really, really, again, slow build-up of a track. It starts off, you've essentially got almost like a minute and a half of just a piano key, like the bing, 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 just really, really subtle, but it's very haunting and very unnerving. It's building up to something, and it's got this kind of, if you're familiar with shepherd tones, the way that they constantly rise or fall in this sort of almost like auditory hallucination where it sounds like they're going up or down forever. And that's kind of the song's got that kind of feeling to it, where you're never quite sure of where it's building or when it's going to end. So it just adds like layers and layers of anxiety on top of itself. And it's, again, a fantastic track. And that was actually one that wasn't featured in the film, which is such a shame. The sort of the feeling of that track in particular, I remember when I first discovered the bootleg of the album years and years ago, that was one that I kept coming back to and just listening to because I loved the song so much. And yeah, it's a real shame that it didn't make it into the film, but it does make it into Hateful Eight. And I haven't seen the film for a while, but I believe that the scene that it takes place in is when they're sort of all walking through the snow and trying to get things. They're trying to like get things into the building, like just before a snowstorm takes place, and it really it hits home really, really well. So it found a good home, so to speak. Finally, the last song, again, another one that never made it onto the original film but did make it onto Hateful Eight, is Despair. So there's a horn section throughout some of this soundtrack, which is very haunting and quite somber in a way. Like it's got sort of almost like a finality to the way it sounds. Like there's a level of like it sort of represents like their fate is sealed, and it shows up. The motif shows up elsewhere, but it's front and center in the song Despair, which is the final track on here, in fact. And I just think the way that it builds, and as I say, that it has that horn section, the do 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 do, and brings itself back down as soon as that crescendo hits, and then woof, straight back down. Just a masterfully put together song. Again, didn't get used in the film, but found its way onto Hateful Eight. So I'm very glad that these songs did see the light of day as an actual film score or film soundtrack. It would, lovely to have them on CD and bootleg and vinyl regardless, but it would have been such a shame for them to not be the background of, such important scenes in cinema history. So I'm glad that they finally got to do that. As I say, outside of that, it's very simple score. A lot of it is ambient and kind of not what you would expect from Ennio Morricone if you're kind of going in with just a general knowledge of him. But this, I think, is in many ways one of his best works, because he doesn't have the melody as the sort of thing to draw you in. It's purely mood, and I think that's probably a darn sight harder to grip a viewer or a listener without having the hooks and the sort of the lead lines that you remember from things like A Few Dollars More and stuff. So yeah, if you haven't heard this album, or if you haven't watched the film, I mean, absolutely go out and watch it, go out and listen to it as soon as you can. As far as picking up a copy of this, you can still get sort of second-hand copies of this pressing, the Waxworks pressing, fairly well priced. I think you'd be looking around sort of like £50 to £60, which is not too bad. But if you follow them on any sort of social media, or if you check out the social medias, particularly Instagram, they are currently teasing some sort of a pressing which looks very similar to this, but with a blue backing instead of a clear backing. And I don't know for sure if it is, but most people in the comments seem to think it is, and it certainly would make sense given how the sort of artwork of the film looks, shall we say. I think the likelihood is they are gearing up for another new pressing of this record. So do keep your eyes peeled, because that may well be sort of hitting the shelves fairly soon if we're lucky. So have a look for that one if you're looking to get a copy. If not, as I say, this is accessible in a general sense. It's not the cheapest thing, but you can definitely get hold of a copy easily if you need to. But yeah, keep an eye out for that new one, and I certainly will be as well. So yeah, just a fantastic album. Other than that, hope you all have a lovely new year, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.